Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the second webinar series hosted by Actigraph. Today's topic is how to plan and execute a successful clinical trial wearable program. This is Rob Wilson. I'm the head of business development and corporate strategy for Actigraph, and I am joined on today's webinar with Jeremy White, who is our Chief Technology Officer and Senior VP of Product Development, and Tyler Guthrie, who is heading up our new division as Director of Scientific Affairs. Before we get started, it looks like we've got a little over 200 participants signed up for today's webinar, and a really good mix of our academic as well as pharma clients. But for those who are joining us and may not be that familiar with Actigraph, we've just put a few highlights of our company up here. As many of you do know, we were founded in 2004, and most of our academic and government research clients have been using our high-resolution hardware and software solutions to study chronic care and population health for over 12 years. And largely because of this, when the evolution of consumer-centric wearables got launched about 4 or 5 years ago, it increased the visibility of how these tools might be used in a clinical trial environment to actually improve the clinical trial process and patient care. And we've been quite fortunate. Our device is a 510K registered device, and we have quite a bit of validation around these academic studies that we've done. And because of that, pharma sponsors and CROs reached out to us to help them in the early stages of trying to develop these solutions in the clinical trial marketplace. So we've been fortunate to work with many of the leading pharma innovation teams, and today we've concluded over 50 pharmaceutical clinical trial projects. And what we'd like to do today is go through a specific example of that in the webinar. Just as a refresher, many of you joined us for our digital biomarker webinar a few weeks ago, and to recap why we're so enthusiastic about the evolution of digital biomarkers in a clinical trial environment. And of course, we believe that chronic disease and its intervention typically impact activity and sleep metrics. And our overall driving view is that in 5 to 10 years, most all clinical trials and post-marketing approval will include some form of wearable sensing. And the reasons are really articulated on this slide, that the ability to have objective measures of activity and sleep, to pull that in a real-world environment in near real time. And as many of us know, the good study by Ken Getz and his team at Tufts, the clinical trial process itself is extremely expensive and over $2 billion and extremely time-consuming, over 8 years to conduct a clinical trial. And with these new tools, we believe that we can improve both the efficiency and the efficacy of these trials as articulated here on the slide. So now what I'd like to do is turn it over to Jeremy and Tyler. We promised that we'd go kind of a deeper dive into a specific case study that articulates how these tools are deployed in the clinical trial session. So Jeremy?
Thank you, Rob, and thanks again to everyone joining today. We had great participation in our last webinar, and are looking forward to some good feedback from you all on this one. So this will be a very organic discussion. Tyler's going to spend the lion's share of the time just going through a specific case study example of how we've seen these wearables, not just our wearables, but technology be deployed in clinical trials and some of the processes that we go through. So, our process of deploying into a clinical trial is three-phase. We have a pre-planning phase. So Tyler's going to walk through, the timeline and how do we work together on protocol development. What should you look for when you're doing those things? What are some key components of the statement of work that are meaningful when you're engaging with the technology vendor in a clinical trial? What about training? How does that work? And secondly, the deployment stage this is where the rubber meets the road. How are logistics handled? How should they be handled? What should we think about? What about the deployment if I'm using a cellular appliance like our data hub, but there are other options out there with other vendors? How's the project managed? Or what do we do about issues, and how do we get around those? And then finally, analytics. How do we? What's important when we look at this data? What are we analyzing? Some important factors around that we'll talk about today include wear compliance and how do we do that? What are we looking for? But what about data transfers? How do SMEs, that's the bottom bullet there, subject matter experts, how do they assist, and how are they onboarded and helping with analytics, and then and how does that work? So Actigraph has been used in a mix of exploratory, secondary, and primary endpoints in clinical trials. And today we're going to illustrate this specific case example. The endpoint that we were looking for, or were used as, was a level of activity. So they were specifically looking at, the sponsor wanted to know, they wanted to ensure that subjects in this particular study were not overly active. And that seems a little counterintuitive, but the intervention was a myostatin inhibitor. So they were looking to ensure that the effectiveness of the drug. We want to make sure that this drug is actually doing what it's supposed to, increasing muscle mass, rather than being a side effect of increased physical activity. So sort of eliminating the activity component of that. This was a 130 subject study across 30 international sites. Our timeline for the study was a 2-year timeline. We thought it was a great case example, so Tyler's going to walk through the majority of that. I did want to make this point up front around considerations. We often are called and someone wants to talk about the wearable. We've just received 510K clearance on our brand new Centerpoint Insight watch, and we're very excited about that. But it is just a single component of the overall system. What's important is to understand who are the stakeholders when we're looking at a digital clinical endpoint. Who's involved here? And you guys know the answer. I mean, sponsors, CROs, technology vendors, sites, patients. All of these stakeholders play a role in successfully extracting a meaningful digital clinical endpoint. And so we're going to touch on those. So we at Actigraph are just one of the technology vendors that are out there. I mean, there's ePro, there's back-end analytics, smart inhalers, other wearables. But regardless of the technology and regardless of the digital endpoint, what we found is, and I'll say this again, the ecosystem approach, the multifaceted approach to doing that is what we have found to be critical. And so today, Tyler's going to talk about all these aspects that kind of center around our how we deploy in a clinical trial, and kind of walk you through some of those. One more consideration is the operational and regulatory framework. In all that we do here and all that most technology vendors are trying to do in the area of clinical trials, we've got to be aware of the regulatory and operational framework in which we operate. It's not uncommon for us here at Actigraph to have multiple audits and assessments from not only sponsors but from other regulatory agencies every year. And so we see those things happening, and the importance of a quality system cannot be overstated here. So we're not going to talk specifically much about the quality system today, but know that it's there and know that it's crucial as we look at how do we have design control over what we're creating and selling, and how do we handle complaints, and how is your vendor going to handle complaints? What's being done about privacy? What about sponsor assessments for compliance and good clinical practice? How's your technology vendor going to handle that, and what should the approach be? And then data archival and documentation, how does that happen? And so you'll hear hints of this today. Just know that the overarching drive for that is that it's important to consider these when you operate in that clinical trial space. So I'm going to turn over to Tyler. He's going to walk you through the process here. So we're going to start with this pre-planning phase. Tyler?
Thank you, Jeremy. So Jeremy mentioned we kind of have 3 phases that we're going to go over. So the first is pre-planning. So that's what we're going to hit first. So this next slide is really just a high-level timeline for that study starts. So you can see it's about a 5-month process from that first reach out and request for proposal until that first subject, first visit. That's what this case study's timeline looked like, and that's pretty typical for most of the studies that we see. The main things on this slide are that we have that request for proposal, and then there's a little bit of time between when that proposal is supplied and when that contract is actually executed. So that's typically around 1 to 2 month timeline. But between there's a lot of calls and a lot of discussions on how a platform operates, general data questions, especially if it's a study team's first experience with a wearable device, or in our case, an actigraphy data. So a couple things in between there are what we say protocol review. We do like to be roped in early on so that we can help the study team with a couple things that they may not consider in terms of wear time, wear compliance, and endpoints. Another that we have on the screen is academic research partnership. We'll go into that a little bit more, but we do have academic research partners that have been using this type of data and performing trials for a long time that we do try to match up with these different clinical trials. So I mentioned protocol development. So we've seen over 50 different clinical trials, and we like to be involved early so that we can help assist, mainly around wear scheduling and endpoints. So with wear schedule, over collection or under collection can be an issue. The whole goal, and you'll hear this repeated, is to reduce the burden on the patient and the site. So if we're over collecting data, you may be asking more than what's needed from your patients and your sites. If you're under collecting, you may not have enough data to put meaning to your trial. For endpoints, we really want to help you select the best endpoints for this specific therapeutic area. We've seen what's been presented in protocols and what's been approved, so that's something that we would like to help with. So if we're brought in early, that's something that we can assist with. So for the next slide, so we at Actigraph, we've seen that those protocols, and we have experience, but I mentioned our academic relationships. So with those relationships, we have research partners that have experience with our devices, our high resolution data, and some of those specific therapeutic areas that our clinical trial space is in. So we try to partner these researchers to help the clinical trial team with protocol development, data analysis, and everything in between to kind of create the best workflow and really the most efficient trial that we can. So for this case study, they did reach out to us fairly early on in the process, and we were able to match them up with one of our subject matter experts. So they provided guidance on things like wear compliance cutoffs, what's a valid day, how long of a data collection period do we need, the total amount of data needed to give meaning to this data, and how to interpret all that. So Jeremy mentioned, as far as the study background, that the goal of the drug was to increase muscle mass. So the endpoint was a little different. We're not looking for an increase in physical activity, which a lot of other trials are looking for. They actually wanted to ensure that subjects weren't increasing physical activity, and that's how they determined if a subject was being compliant. So part of what the SME did was create those cutoffs and help the study team decide what's going to be a compliant subject and what's not. So it's not just a matter of just collecting data, but choosing how you're going to interpret that data, and that's what our subject matter experts help with. So this next study, this next slide is around the SOW. So a lot of people kind of think of wearable devices as just the device, just the hardware piece. But on this SOW, we highlight there is a hardware component, but there's also a software component along with a lot of different services that are available. For this study, there were 130 subjects, 30 sites. The endpoint was the level of activity, and our ecosystem is priced per patient per year, not just for a device. So that's something to consider as well. Once the SOW has been signed, we do assign an Actigraph project manager. So that's someone that's going to be with the study through the life of the study. We want to make sure that that if there's anything needed by the study team, we can address that. So part of the role of that project manager is to be on regular calls. They are all GCP certified. They are the prime person to be contacted for any type of site initiation and logistics for those actual site shipments. Part of what the project manager does is training, not just for the sites, but for the study team as well. Part of what we do is really just education, how to use the device, how to use the platform, how to look at the data. So we're on these regular kickoff meetings with the study teams. Along with the study team and our project manager, we work with creating patient and site guides that are customized for the study. We want those to so the site and the patients can be communicated with the best way possible. We do attend investigator meetings. For this study, we attended one investigator meeting in Europe and one in the US. So for those, we like attending those, and we also like kind of our method is to do breakout sessions at those investigator meetings. We think that some hands-on training is one of the best ways to remember the actual steps of using the device, but also getting the investigators more comfortable with using this type of technology that they may not be familiar with. Part of, again, everything that we do, we want to reduce the burden on these investigators, on these sites, on the patients. So we do want to train those sites and investigators the best way possible. So I mentioned investigator meetings, but we also normally provide as many WebEx sessions as needed to refresh their memory. The smoother things go, the happier the sites are, and the better that they communicate with the patients. So our first poll question is, how likely are you to discuss protocol development with a wearable device company in an upcoming clinical trial or research trial? So we're going to put that up, and our options are not likely, somewhat likely, very likely, or you've already done so. So we'll give you just a minute to kind of answer. Okay, and it looks like just about everyone's put in their vote. Okay, so here we got in the lead is somewhat likely at 37%, then very likely at 33%, followed by not likely and have already done so. So with that, we're going to move from pre-planning to deployment. So deployment is really the bulk of the study. So that's when we are sending out our patient site packages, collecting data, and what we do in the process before that database lock. So one of the first things is logistics. We have to get these patient packages and site packages to the sites. So we have a logistics platform in Centerpoint. All inventory is pulled for the study after the SOW has been signed. So that way there's no supply issues at all. It also allows for direct shipping to domestic and international sites. With the platform, our study team is able to view the shipments, and they can also pull up the tracking info so they can see when those were sent out and when they can be expected to arrive at the sites. One thing that we found out after a few studies in is that it really helps if we create a commercial invoice and have that approved by either the study team or CRO. That way it just spends less time in a customs agent's hands and gets to the site quicker. We also pay for VAT, and that's outlined in the SOW. And that's just one less thing that the site has to worry about. So again, the whole goal, reduce burden on the site. We want them to just have to worry about getting the site and starting that process. So Actigraph takes care of the customs and VAT info. So before I jump into what it looks like at the site level for actually assigning a device and uploading any data, I did kind of want to go over our data flow. So step one is the site investigator just needs to walk into the system. They'll initialize the device. Then within our platform, the subject's info is created. And then the subject would go and perform data collection. And then that data is going to be uploaded a couple different ways. For this study, they were using our data hub. So it was able to be uploaded in near real time at the patient's home. So for the site, the only thing they have to download is a small syncing application we call ActiSync. Part of this process that Actigraph performs is done on the front end. So before anything actually gets to the site, all the settings for the device are set between Actigraph and the study team. That way we take a lot of the technical aspects out of the hands of the site to make everything as easy as possible. So once these are set up front, all the site has to worry about is just plugging that device in, and then they're going to click Assign Subject Now. That will then prompt a new window to automatically pop up. So here we see there's nothing technical the site has to do. For this study, they were just collecting the subject ID, date of birth, and weight. And those can be customized, and that's done on the front end again with the study team and Actigraph. But it's pretty minimal as far as what the site had to do to actually assign that device. Once they click Assign Device to a new subject, it'll pull up a confirmation screen. And that confirmation screen just lets them know that the device has been assigned, it's been initialized, and it's good for to hand off to the subject for data collection. If a site or if a study is using a data hub, like this case study was, that device would then be paired with the hub at the site. This is really a key feature that we created a couple years ago. So this data hub will be then go home with the subject, and that's how we get that near real-time data from the subject's home.
Tyler, I just want to step in and make kind of one important observation or point here as we walk through how a study works. It's important to kind of note that each study is different, not only for Actigraph, but for any technology vendor, in how you get this technology, implemented in the patient's home or even at the site. In our case, we found that sometimes those patients or those sites will want to use this cellular data hub, which gets sent home with the patient and provides a mechanism to passively capture that data from the home. And that's what you're seeing here. A couple of options here that can be done wirelessly or wired, as we see here. The other option is a more cost-effective option is that we do that at the site. So there is no data hub, or maybe we use only one data hub at the site. The point being, we want to minimize the burden, but also hit the price point for the customer. And so there's a balance there. And so it's hard to have a case study that gives the example of all of those aspects. But if any of you are interested in kind of walking through that specific for years, we can talk about that or talk to that. But just to kind of make the point that, there are different modalities that exist for capturing this data, depending on budget, depending on preference, depending on your affinity, how do you want to handle your patients and sites. So I just wanted to make that point because as we walk through this, I think we see these different opportunities, but maybe it's not totally clear to the audience today and how that all ties together.
Thanks, Jeremy. So Jeremy mentioned you do have we have the option of using the data hub or not using the data hub. So if you're using it or not, for this study, they still performed a additional upload at the site when that subject came back. All they had to do was just plug in that device. The upload automatically occurs. If you weren't using the data hub, you would rely on that next subject visit to check their compliance, which is what you see on the screen now. So this is around a 7-day collection here. But that way the site can see that subject's compliance. That's the first thing they'd see on the screen. And that's kind of their chance to intervene there, to say, hey, you did a great job, or please, be more compliant, wear that device for a little bit longer. Like any clinical trial, there's always a few issues that come up. These were just some minor ones. The point is that there's always some issues, but we have a team that's available to address any of these. So some of these have to do with some minor IT issues, which are resolved pretty easily. Others revolve around our project managers that can address these either directly with the sites or with the study teams. So small issues like these come up, but the resolution is usually pretty straightforward and pretty easy for us. So we have our second poll question. So the question is, what are your major concerns at the site level when it comes to deploying a wearable device? So your options are too complex and time consuming for the site investigator, IT or technology challenges, miscommunication between site and patient, or study delays from lack of preparation. So we'll give you just a couple minutes to vote on that.
While you're all voting, I want to mention that I've had a question or two come in from the questions panel in the GoToWebinar system. If you have some questions you want to post there, please do. We'll try our best to get to those at the end of the webinar, and if we don't, we'll reach out to you via email. But we're happy to entertain your questions through that question panel that you see on the side of your screen there. All right, we're at about 70% voted, Tyler, so we'll give them another 10 seconds.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, so it looks like our results are the highest was the biggest issue they see is a IT or technology challenge, followed by miscommunication between site and patient, and then either too complex or time consuming, and last is study delays from lack of preparation.
Yeah, I appreciate it. That kind of aligns with what we often see in initial setup for a study is curiosity around the technology challenges. I think, if you talk to a vendor like ourselves, we live and breathe this technology every day, and so it's sort of second nature to us. But we do understand that when you're talking to a site who's dealing with a patient, they're dealing with paperwork sometimes even, that can become a little bit confusing. And so, we totally appreciate that. And so, again, it's great feedback from you all. Thank you for that information there.
All right, so our next phase is the third phase, which is what we call kind of analytics. So this screen here revolves around wear compliance. I had another wear compliance screen earlier. That was really just a site upload wear compliance check. Since this case study, the study used data hubs, they were able to look at in near real time if the subject was being compliant or not. So in the platform, we try to make it as easy as possible. Green is good, red is bad. So this was a good, what I consider a good subject when it comes to wearing the device. These data hubs enable you to get near real-time data, but one thing that you may not consider and may not even think of is what are you going to do with that data? You need some type of mechanism to actually take action. So here for the study team, they decided to have the sites check each subject on a weekly basis, and if the compliance was below X number of days per week, then that's when they would intervene and reach out to the subject. So that decision can be made at the study team level, but it's just something that you want to consider. So here around data transfers, we have a few points. To the right is CTTI's recommendations on wearable device data. So it's a great group. If you haven't heard of them, I would definitely follow them and read up. This is kind of just their executive summary around data collection, analysis, and interpretation. For any wearable device, you do want to know what data types you're getting. So for our device, you're getting raw data, the minute-by-minute Epic data, and then the calculated outcomes as well. Here we see cost is proportional to data size and frequency. So the more data, the larger data sets, and the more often you're getting it, that also relates to how much that is costing you on your side. So the more data, the more frequently that you're getting it, you're asking your data team to sort through that data on a more regular basis. So part of, I mentioned earlier about RSME, what's under collection, what's over collection. So there's someone that can speak to that and help you along that path as well. We do uphold the 25-year regulatory requirement of housing your data. And then lastly, the mechanism. How are you retrieving this data? So we have an API system where you can perform data pulls. We can also send the data to your SFTP server, or you can pull it from our FTPS server.
And Tyler, just for our audience that maybe are not in clinical trials, maybe some of our academic research partners that might be watching today, maybe talk a little bit just about a data transfer. That's typically a line item in an SOW, right? And so maybe just around what do we have to do to prepare for that? That might help them give a little context there.
Yeah, so we have what we call kind of standard data transfer template. With that, for especially the research side, we can send that over to the research team where we can make it available in an export. Some study teams think that this needs to be completed and the specifications need to be set on the front end before that first subject comes in. For Actigraph, that's not the case. Since we're collecting the raw data and these endpoints are being calculated after the fact, that's not an issue for us. If the study team researcher, if they have to set their SAP on the front end, then that's something that we can work with and help them set those specifications. But that's not really something that we have to set on the front end. But we do have a whole list of the type of endpoints that you get with those reports. They're provided in a CSV file, and we do have on a slide upcoming kind of real high level what a few of those endpoints look like.
We'll move on to the next slide, but just from a technology side here. So Tyler's working primarily in the project management realm. I'm over in the technology side. And so when we're asked to do a data transfer, we're literally talking about how do we get this data out of our system and over to a place where you all might work on or interpret that data. And so sometimes that can be a lot of data, right, Tyler? So it could be raw data. Sometimes it's epic data. So what we've seen trends in the industry, and I think it's heading this way, is the closer we can get to automating that transfer of data through an API, the more streamlined that's going to get. But sometimes we get hung up here. So I just thought it was interesting to kind of point that out. And then this next slide is kind of the example from the case study, right?
Right. So here we have this is part of our standard template. So we have subject, time, step, stamps, or steps, and this is just part of our template. We can provide this to your data team. And then typically there's a lot of back and forth between Actigraph's data analysts and the studies data team. And that way we can customize how this is formatted and what data you're getting. We provide a lot of data. If that's too much, we can cut down on that. But it's really talking with your data team and customizing it so that it fits into the system appropriately to make it easier for them. So I talked a little bit earlier about our SME and the work that they did on the front end, but they also performed work on the back end as far as data analysis. So part of what they did was they recommended which algorithms would be most applicable for this therapeutic area, and then some of the data analysis that they performed was really interesting. So they did see some subjects that had some spikes in CK levels. So they wanted to see were those spikes due to an adverse event or a side effect from the drug, or was it because some type of spike in physical activity? So the SME was able to do some additional analysis and show that it was due to a spike in activity. So their overall activity was fairly sedentary, but they did have these certain spikes before that collection occurred, and they were able to show that it wasn't a negative effect from the study drug, it was just that spike in activity. Something else the SME did was they helped set what they would consider a compliant and non-compliant subject. So they took a week or two baseline data from each subject and created kind of cut points for what they said, what they considered for each subject to be sedentary, and then what's the threshold to where that subject was too active to be involved in the study. So up above, that first subject, they were considered compliant because they maintained an activity pattern that was similar to their baseline data. But that non-compliant subject, we see that they had an increase in activity, which then that data was decided to be not used in that data analysis. And so now we have a third poll question for you. So what do you see as your biggest hurdles to analyzing wearable data? And your options are lack of a measurement standard, lack of clarity around the appropriate endpoint, approach to FDA on claim, and data size and analytics capabilities. So I'll give you guys just a minute to vote on this.
All right, we're at about 56%. So if you guys want to get your answers in, we'll give about 10 or 15 more seconds there. These are questions that we get all the time around hurdles and what are we going to do with this data. Tyler mentioned the CTTI slide a minute ago. Some great recommendations about how to prepare your team for that and how to get your data the way you want it, and don't get too much data. Make sure you get enough data. There's a trade-off. So it'll be interesting to see kind of where this falls. So we're at about 76% of you voting, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results with you here. I think. Here we go. There we go. Okay, so yeah, it's kind of across the board. So around lack of measurement standard, man, I'd love to have a webinar on that, just to speak to measurement standards. But lack of clarity around the appropriate endpoint. Sure, how do we know what we're going to do here with the data, and then data size and analytics capability. So yeah, just about 30% across each of those. So that's interesting. Thanks. So this is our conclusion slide here. If I can get the webinar to show the, let's see here. Well, I had trouble getting our screen to share. Stand by 1 second here. Okay, there we go. So as Tyler's wrapping up here, I'll just walk through just kind of high-level conclusions here as we wrap up. As we've said at the outset, and as kind of our mantra here at ActiGraph, that most chronic diseases and their interventions will impact activity and sleep. And so we know that wearables are going to be a critical part of clinical trials and academic research moving forward. And we know that you all have a great interest in using and utilizing that data in the right way. We know that, as the second bullet says here, we've got an opportunity to have an objective overview of activity and sleep in near real time. I think often back to Ray Dorsey's statement, if you're familiar with his work around how, we don't have a lot of clarity in some of these subjective measures as to whether or not we're doing good with our intervention or whether we're making a difference in the patient's lives. And so we've got a great opportunity here with objective measures. I hope you've come out of this today with a better understanding of how multifaceted these different solutions can be for technology vendors. There's certainly a lot of stakeholders involved. There's certainly a lot of considerations around regulatory and operational. So just an important component of how this is done. We think, as the fourth bullet says, that an ecosystem approach really helps to mitigate a lot of these challenges that you're going to encounter. And so that's been really kind of important for us here at ActiGraph, and important for a lot of technology vendors as they try to bring a solution that works in this environment. For us, we found that these, what we're calling subject matter experts, are valuable. In our case, these are our research partners who we've worked with for decades to really tease out meaning from the data in a controlled environment. A lot of times they can come in and speak directly to the therapeutic area, the population, and the specifics of a study to help articulate a really solid protocol at the outset and maximize the value of the data that you're going to capture. And then finally, clinical trial efficiency and efficacy can really be improved while enhancing patient outcomes. And so, there's a win-win in this situation with technology, and we hope we can help you along the way as you move down the path of that. So we want to just hit this last question here about our next webinar. You're going to get a survey right after this. When you close your browser today, you're going to see a 4-question survey. It'll also come out via email, but we'd like you to help us choose our next webinar. We've got 4 options here, and let me give a little bit of clarity around each of those. The first one is the interpretation of wearable sensor data, with discussions around how high-resolution data can be leveraged. And so there's an opportunity to speak with maybe one of our partners that we are looking to work with in 2019 and discuss with you all, hey, how might we interpret this data at kind of the summary level, but also the high-resolution level? How might we do some machine learning and artificial intelligence on this data? Secondly is an FDA roadmap for primary endpoint label claim. We've got some experience in how that works, opportunity possibly to speak on that. Third option is evolution of wearable hardware and software to improve patient care. So you've seen our new release of the CenterPoint Insight Watch, but moving forward with technology, where is it heading? Where has it been? What are some opportunities that are there? And then fourthly, using academic research to develop chronic care clinical endpoints. So you hear us talk all the time about subject matter experts. This webinar might bring in one of those experts from the academic world to speak with us around how might that initial discussion go with a partner who is looking to implement wearables in clinical trials or technology in clinical trials. What are some points that they might include in that discussion? So we're going to close out. I've got a couple of questions that have come up, and we're just under the 45-minute timeline, so I'll try to hit those verbally. But if you have any questions, please feel free to send them our way. We can do our best to answer those via email. I had 2 questions right out of the gate around Canada. So we've just received our ISO 13485 certification, and so if you're curious about Canada sales or Canadian clinical trials, nothing to worry about there. We've just received that certification. We should be fully ISO 13485 in the next 3 to 4 months here. So please do follow up with us on that. So a couple of people recommending about the next webinar. Make sure you click on, when you close out, click on the one that you would choose there. That'll help us. A couple of questions about how to get started with developing APIs and getting custom data exports from Centerpoint. Sarah is asking that question. Sarah, if we can follow up with you, I can give you some great starters and guidelines on how to do that. We actually have some pretty good documentation on our GitHub repository that can give you some information about how to get started there. And so I can send that your way. Had a question from Derek about considering a cellular modem that would bypass all the IT problems. Derek, we do have a data hub. It is a cellular appliance that goes in the patient's home that sits right there in their home and uploads data passively a couple of times a day. What was that?
Or at the site.
Well, yeah, or that's also so. At the data hub can be used at the site as well to deploy the wearable to the patient, so that we can completely bypass the hospital network there. Let's see. Information around cut points and how to select the correct cut points from Robert. Robert, great question. Tyler will be happy to answer that. So that's part of what he does every day, is on the phone with our partners to say, hey, how do we choose the right one for us here? So be happy to help you consult with that. Jonathan's asking, can we get a copy of the webinar slides? Absolutely. We'll have those available in an email coming out to you in the next 2 days. And these are great questions. Okay, I think I've in general covered most of the questions here. I have 2 questions about NIH grant support. We have done that in the past. We've supported grants, and we're depending on the level of the need there, we're happy to help with some of that. But of course, it depends on the grant, depends on our availability. But please do reach out to us. One question about NIH supporting our technology from Daniel. I don't know about supporting it, but they've used it multiple times in several different studies, specifically the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, or the NHANES survey. Our products have been used in that extensively over the past decade. I think I've covered most of these, but if you guys have more questions, we're going to try to hit these via email just to get back to you after the webinar. But hey, we're very grateful and thankful that you took the time to attend today. You'll receive the survey, as I've said. Please take a moment and answer that for us. We'll also follow up with an email with instructions on how you can download these slides and watch this webinar again. But thank you all so much for your time. We greatly appreciate your attention, and we look forward to hearing from you guys and seeing you in the next webinar.